I'm excited about all of this because I believe in higher education. I believe in tertiary education and universities, and that universities and knowledge are the drivers of all of the change that we're seeing in the world. But I just think we can all do a better job of showcasing that, showcasing how great this hub of learning is and how core and essential it is to all social and economic development.
Hello and welcome to the UIIN Future of Universities podcast series. I am your host for today. My name is Madeline Arkins. I'm a research project officer at UIIN. During the 2023 UIIN Conference, we had a captivating conversation with Roberta Malee Bassett, Global Lead for Tertiary Education at the World Bank. We delved into the crucial role of education in driving global development and the World Bank's endeavours in promoting educational equity worldwide. We hope you enjoyed the discussion. I am joined here today by Roberta Malee Bassett, the Global Lead for Tertiary Education at the World Bank. Roberta, would you mind telling us a bit about your role at the World Bank?
Sure, happy to. As the Global Lead for Tertiary Education at the bank, I oversee the World Bank's global portfolio of higher education projects, which currently is active in about 70 active projects, $6 billion or so, with another $1.5 billion in the pipeline to be approved in the next 2 years. This is in every region where the World Bank operates, and we support lower and lower middle income countries, but also middle income countries in higher education interventions. The projects we work on are bilaterally crafted with the country who is taking out the World Bank loan or accessing the World Bank grant to support tertiary education reforms. So they are bespoke. They're crafted to support specific questions, specific interventions to the country's targeted needs. We have a very dynamic process of engaging our clients as we work with them to support higher education reform.
Great, thank you. That was a wonderful description. So as you said, you tend to work with a lot of lower and middle income countries. Mm-hmm. What do you see as specific challenges and opportunities? Now, obviously, low and middle income countries are not a homogenous group.
Correct.
In your mind, what are you seeing as the most pressing challenges or trends in your work?
That's really sort of the key question for what we're doing. In 2021, we crafted the Steering Tertiary Education Report, which actually is an acronym for what we see as the 5 key pillar areas requiring intervention support in our client countries. The first is the diversification of higher education systems. We see in much of the world the need to expand the modalities of delivery, the opportunities for students. We have an expanded enrollment growth across especially low and middle income countries, while simultaneously public financing, while growing, is not growing at the pace of expansion. And so diversifying the systems will allow for multiple institution types, programmatic adaptations that will support more students. And so that's the first pillar. The second one is technology. I don't think we need to talk about technology, but prior to COVID, we would have actually said that there was an over focus on technology because it's very expensive and because the half-life of technology is shrinking, so that these massive expenses are often obsolete very quickly. Post-COVID, obviously we're all thinking differently about technology based largely on what we've learned, and that we can see a capacity for some sustained interventions with technology becoming more important, making those investments make sense. But still being very cautious because of the digital divide that was also exposed during COVID, where a lot of students were just dropped off completely because technology couldn't serve them. So technology is kind of a challenge, but an opportunity as well. Then we have equity, which also, again, we focus on equity for the entirety of the World Bank's time working higher education, which is since the early 60s. Equity may be the most fundamental issue that we focus on. Simply investing in higher education in developing countries is an equity driver. And then efficiency, and in this we talk about efficiency both in operational efficiency but also financing efficiency, but making systems work better, making them work with the financing they have, making them work in a regulatory manner with high quality and a focus on talent and the people who work in the system, as well as good data collection. And we know in much of the world, data for higher education, understanding the sector is very difficult. Either it's non-existent or it's very poor, and so it makes it very difficult to make informed evidence-based decisions. And so we really are supporting improved data. And then the last is resilience. Resilience is entirely a concept built out of COVID, but not exclusive to COVID, because as we're seeing in much of the world too, between climate change, political disruption, and other upheavals that society face, resilience in the sector is going to be increasingly important. So those are the 5 key areas of focus that we see needing targeted attention.
Great, thank you. I know that you have a lot of experience in higher education policy also. I wondered what your own personal opinion would be on policy, international, national, however you wish to take the question, policy that would facilitate this progress towards equity in education.
Well, I do think it needs to be purposeful. So policies are required. Equity is not something that happens on its own. In fact, societies are often resistant to the changes required to expand equity, right? They do require purposeful admission policies, financing policies, all sorts of recognition of maybe social weaknesses that need to be corrected through equity interventions, and that's very painful for societies often to address. Policy is required to sort of accelerate and give a framework to equity interventions. There's no question that we need policymakers on board for equity interventions, but very often policymakers are the drivers of these dialogues and ideas because they see in their communities a need to improve the lot of their citizens, right? The lot of their people. And so equity is personal, it's on the ground, it's communal as much as it is policy and intervention oriented. And so it's a bread and butter issue for policymakers all over the world.
What innovative approaches or strategies do you believe are necessary to bridge the gap between the current workforce and the very changing needs of the market? You mentioned technological disruptions, how we're all doing online school currently and we're still riding that wave. What sort of technological innovations would bridge that gap?
I do think that there needs to be a broader holistic conversation around the preparation of individuals for work, right? The onus of this is being placed very heavily on universities because universities are an easy target. They're very expensive to fund. They're publicly funded in most of the world, and so they're an easy target. But they can't do this alone, right? They can't define the terms and then develop the skills and do all the things, which they do tend to do quite well. But they need the conversation to be much more holistic. And by that I mean with policymakers who also talk about opportunities for entrepreneurial lending, borrowing, right? That there are tax policies that allow multinational corporations to come in and benefit from a highly skilled workforce, that all of these issues maybe around visas and mobility and the full compendium of policy issues that then impact the workforce cannot just be borne by the universities themselves. And so universities can do a better job, I think, engaging that external community. Very often they get increasingly insular around what they're doing because it's a natural defensive mechanism to be, we are good at what we do, but the world outside needs to also see that, and the conversation actually brings more people in to understand what universities are doing well. I think, too, a lot more graduate tracer studies, a lot more data. I've been saying this a lot, but even here in the conversations I've been a part of here, a lot of talk is on the research that's being done around inputs, but there's not a whole lot being done around outcomes, and I would say more and more needs to be done to analyze and understand the outcomes of these interventions so that when information is required to make change or to push policy, there's data that says there's a real good reason to do that. And I think there's a big gap there on understanding the outcomes of some of these key interventions that bring industry and universities closer together.
Another question I would like to ask is related to the sustainability transition, tackling climate change. I know that's also an area that the World Bank is addressing. You also said that a lot of is expected of universities at this time to address all these different societal challenges. I wonder, what is your own opinion from your role of what universities should do or have done in this fight?
Well, I can speak on two levels. The World Bank actually now requires all of our projects to measure climate co-benefits. And so regardless of the intervention, whether it's the energy sector, it's building roads, or it's supporting tertiary education, there is a segment in all of our projects that specifies interventions related to climate change. And so we, at a corporate level, are looking at making sure every intervention is recognizing this key shift, this key change that's going to be impacting all of humanity, really. At the university level, again, I just think universities are perfectly positioned to say, we can have an impact here, we can make a difference. And they do the research. All of this information about climate change has emerged from university research. They are the hubs of the knowledge generation, but also the dissemination of information. They can do better, I think, embedding the conversation around climate change into the curriculum. We talk about that with internationalization as well. The conversation around internationalization can happen in any topic area. Any discipline can have sort of international elements brought in. The same can be true about climate change if you're talking about philosophy or sociology or anthropology, as much as if you're talking about meteorology or some STEM fields as well. The conversation around the human experience with climate change is significant, and that will translate into social change and behavioral change, even at the corporate level, right? We do believe that. So it is about engaging conversation everywhere that a university is active, from training the students to conducting research to commercialization of research and community engagement. The whole 3 pillars of engagement around climate change is as important as around any topic that we've seen, I think, in our lifetime. So this is going to be the big issue.
I concur. Another thing I'd like to ask you is about, obviously, we're getting increased globalization, cross-border mobility of students. Big topic is building master's degrees from many different institutions, for example, where students can switch between institutions in entirely different countries or continents. What's your opinion on that? How do you see that in the future of education?
I love it, but I love all things that are cross-cultural and cross-border. I think this is going to make the world a better place the more that people engage with other people versus the atmospheric engagement, which can be quite challenging. And we didn't talk much, I think, in general about populism or the shifts in the political climate globally, but it is impacting higher education. The more internationalization happens, the better. I think post-bachelor's degrees especially good, so master's and PhDs. I think when the whole human part of the student development of undergraduate degrees has had its chance to do what it does for making young people fuller, stronger, more in control of their own destiny individuals. Master's degree programs can be stacked. I think the big challenge is always going to be governance and quality assurance regimes and having agility in the regulatory frameworks that deal with cross-border degree recognition or the mobility of degrees. You have that here in Europe quite seamlessly, but in most of the world that's not the case. And there's like multiple steps of validation of courses and degrees to then allow for cross-border mobility of coursework. That would need to be streamlined in a way that allows students to have confidence that going to another place and merging these intellectual and academic experiences will be worthwhile for them and not a bigger problem than it was worth in the doing. That's sort of where we come in, where other policy influencers, I think UIN can actually influence that as well based on the engagements that you have, to see particular challenges outside of the activation of the projects and as a sort of atmospheric and policy environment challenge. And how do you manage policy development to allow for real adaptation to these modern opportunities that students have?
And I feel like the World Bank is also uniquely positioned in that you collaborate so much with higher education institutions and also industry. From your perspective, what are the main challenges of merging those and collaborating with the two?
Well, the World Bank interacts most is with government. So we fund all our projects at the Ministry of Finance level, but we design our projects with interventions from universities and from private sector. I mean, the big challenge is misinformation. I think industry especially is not surprising. I mean, we've never seen an employment survey that said we're super happy with our graduates. I mean, that has never existed, nor will it ever, because the specific interests of an employer would always be a little bit divergent from a general degree program, right? I think that we can accept that that will always be a gap. But also means those of us who discuss policy and want to have an informed conversation about policy have to recognize that gap as well, instead of putting all the weight in a conversation about reforming education around employer surveys, which has happened a lot. The employers that say X, Y, and Z, yes, it's true, but universities aren't vocational institutions. They are knowledge and skills creators in a very broad way. And that partnership has to be, I think, more collaborative to allow industry to feel more ownership over the skills development as well. And that can be in influencing curricular design or influencing experiential learning opportunities and creating pathways for that during the degree program, but also recognize industry can continue to do on-the-job skills formation outside of the university degree, and that's a perfectly reasonable thing to expect from an industry as well, with the specificity of what they need for the tasks that they need for their own corporate institutions. So this conversation is one that we help facilitate a lot, and I know industry actually on a one-on-one basis really do want to be part of that conversation. You know, I said about the African Centers of Excellence project, which is across all of sub-Saharan Africa, and we have, I think right now, 60 or so centers of excellence that are being funded just by the World Bank. But we are constantly getting industry asking, how do we engage these centers of excellence? How do we help them become more commercially relevant? They want to be part of this conversation. So we do serve as a convener of all of these interests in the higher education space to allow for conversations that wouldn't necessarily happen more organically around labor skills development and outcomes for students in the labor market.
Okay. Wearing many hats, the World Bank.
Yes, we do.
We discussed a lot about challenges and difficulties and trends. Is there anything around the topic of future of education that actually excites you?
I'm excited about all of this because I believe in higher education. I believe in tertiary education and universities, and that universities and knowledge are the drivers of all of the change that we're seeing in the world. And I mean, I've said this everywhere, but I just think we can all do a better job of showcasing that, showcasing how great this hub of learning is and how core and essential it is to all social and economic development. I mean, from the very basic, who trains the teachers, who trains the doctors, who trains the engineers that allow for just your day-to-day infrastructure to exist, but also who are the blue sky thinkers that are coming and making the big change. That's coming from higher education and universities and community colleges and further colleges and polytechnics, every form of post-secondary education. It's all amazing. If I had to articulate a problem, is that there is no consistent messaging that says, look how great it is. And I encourage all institutional leaders especially to get out there and say, look what we're doing. Look what our graduates are doing. Look at the change that we're making in the world, because that change is making a difference.
Thank you for listening to today's discussion. Stay tuned for the next episode of the Future of Universities podcast series. Don't forget to follow UIN on LinkedIn and register for our newsletter at uin.org to stay up to date with the latest research insights, events, and more.